Good afternoon. Today's hearings are going to deal with a serious issue, and I trust that members of the public here will take them seriously, as we all do. I want to note at the outset that the rules of the Senate prohibit a showing of approbation or disapprobation, as they say, to put it in English, outburst, clapping, and demonstrations. This includes blocking the view of people around you. Please be mindful of those rules as we conduct this hearing, and I'm thankful that the Capitol Police are here to ensure the safety and security of everyone present. Our identity as Americans is based on ideas and values, hi Ted, not ethnicity nor creed. This is what makes our nation unique. But since its founding, there has been a divide between the promise and reality of America. The man who wrote in our Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal was a slaveholder. The Constitution, our founding charter, which those of us in Congress swear to uphold and defend, originally treated African Americans as property and women as second-class citizens. The history of our country has been a long, slow, and painful march. Brave men and women have fought and sacrificed, sometimes even giving their lives, in the struggle to create a more perfect union that our national charter promised. Many of us think about the greatest generation, the men and women who served our nation so valiantly in World War II. I recently read a story that's an illustration of what America was like in World War II. Italians and Germans who were captured in combat fighting our soldiers were brought to the United States as prisoners of war. They were held in places like military forts, like Fort Benning, Georgia. At Fort Benning, Georgia, the Italian and German prisoners of war had access to make purchases in the base exchange. African American soldiers did not have that opportunity or that access. 2.3 million Americans are incarcerated. That's triple the amount of 30 years ago. 25% for drug offenses. Whites engage in drug offenses at a higher rate than African Americans. But African Americans are incarcerated at a rate 10 times greater than African Americans for these offenses. America has changed. That same military that discriminated against African Americans back during the World War II era is now a nation with an African American commander-in-chief. The election of our first black president shows we've come a long way as a nation. But it is important to recognize and to say very clearly that there is still a challenge with racism in America, and we still have more work to do. This subcommittee has tried to look intently, not just to our past, but to our present and to our future, to examine what more needs to be done to protect civil and human rights in America. We've tried to understand in this subcommittee the human impact of the issues we debate by hearing directly from those most affected. We've given a platform to voices that are not often heard in the halls of Congress. I'd like to show a brief video to remind us all what is at stake. I don't know if we can see it here. In 2001, Eugenia Jennings was sentenced to almost 22 years in prison for selling a small amount of crack cocaine. Her brother, Cedric Parker, testified at a 2009 hearing on the sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine.
Of course, you know my name is Cedric Parker. I'm from Alton, Illinois, and I'm here to tell you the things my sister Eugenia would say if she was here today. The severity of the mandatory minimums, and especially the sharp disparity between those for crack and powder cocaine, have touched my family directly. Eugenia cannot be here because she is in federal prison for selling crack cocaine.
In 2010, after 18 years in prison, to voices that are not often heard in the halls of Congress. I'd like to show a brief video to remind us all what is at stake. If we can see it here. In 2001, Eugenia Jennings was sentenced to almost 22 years in prison for selling a small amount of crack cocaine. Her brother, Cedric Parker, testified at a 2009 hearing on the sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine.
Of course, you know my name is Cedric Parker. I'm from Alton, Illinois, and I'm here to tell you the things my sister Eugenia would say if she was here today. The severity of the mandatory minimums, and especially the sharp disparity between those for crack and powder cocaine, have touched my family directly. Eugenia cannot be here because she is in federal prison for selling crack cocaine.
In 2010, after 18 years in prison, including 16 years in solitary confinement, Anthony Graves became the 12th death row inmate to be exonerated in Texas. In 2012, he testified before this subcommittee at the first ever congressional hearing on solitary confinement.
I have been free for almost 2 years, and I still cry at night because no one out here can relate to what I've gone through. I battle with these feelings of loneliness. I've tried therapy, but it didn't work.
In August 2012, a gunman killed 6 people at a Sikh temple in Oak Creek, including Harpreet Singh Saini's mother. 1 month after his mother died, Harpreet became the first Sikh ever to testify in Congress when he appeared at a subcommittee hearing on hate crime.
Senators, I came here today to ask the government to give my mother the dignity of being a statistic. The FBI does not track hate crimes against Sikhs. My mother and those shot that day will not even count on a federal form. We cannot solve a problem we refuse to recognize.
In 2013, Sabrina Fulton testified at a subcommittee hearing on the impact of so-called stand your ground laws. Her 17-year-old son, Trayvon, was shot and killed while walking through a residential neighborhood in Sanford, Florida.
It's unfortunate what has happened with Trayvon, and that's why I feel like it's so important for me to be here so that you all can at least put a face with what has happened with this tragedy.
Lucy McBath also testified at the subcommittee's hearing on stand your ground laws. Her 17-year-old son, Jordan Davis, was shot and killed while listening to music with his friends in a car outside a convenience store in Jacksonville, Florida.
But you can never really know my boy, because an angry man who owned a gun kept it close at hand and chose to demonstrate unbridled hatred one balmy evening for reasons I will never understand.
Damon Thibodeau spent 15 years in solitary confinement at Louisiana State Penitentiary before he was exonerated in 2012. In 2013, Damon testified about his experience at the subcommittee's second hearing on solitary confinement.
I do not condone what those who have killed and committed other serious offenses have done, but I also don't condone what we do to them when we put them in solitary for years on end and treat them as subhuman. We are better than that. As a civilized society, we should be better than that.
Patty Saylor's son, Ethan, who had Down syndrome, was killed when he was forcibly removed from a movie theater in Frederick, Maryland by 3 off-duty sheriff's deputies. Patty told Ethan's story at the subcommittee's 2014 hearing on law enforcement responses to disabled Americans.
They placed him on the ground, prone restraint, put handcuffs on, and my son died of asphyxiation on that floor of that movie theater for that $10 movie ticket. Ethan was not escalated. He was not threatening. He was not in crisis.
I've often said this committee needs to focus on legislation, not lamentation. And we've taken the words of our witnesses and translated them into action. I worked with the first-ranking subcommittee member here, Tom Coburn of Oklahoma, who's retiring this year. Together we passed 4 laws that give the government more power to prosecute human rights abusers. In 2012, the Obama administration and this authority, under this authority, deported Liberian warlord George Boley for using child soldiers. After we learned of the powerful testimony of Cedric Parker, I worked with Senator Jeff Sessions of Alabama and other members of the committee to pass the Fair Sentencing Act, which significantly reduced the sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine and repealed a mandatory minimum sentence for the first time since the days of the Nixon administration. After the subcommittee held the first ever congressional hearings on solitary confinement, where we heard from Anthony Parker Graves and Damon Thibodeau, the Federal Bureau of Prisons agreed to my request to submit to the first independent assessment of its solitary confinement policies and practices. After we heard the brave testimony of Harpreet Singh, I successfully pushed the Justice Department to begin tracking hate crimes against Sikh Americans, Arab Americans, and Hindu Americans. But we have been reminded in recent days that there is still much work to do. When our government still believes it is acceptable, in the name of security, to profile people based on race, national origin, or religion, there is still more work to do. When Muslim Americans are the targets of violent crimes simply because of their religion, there is still more work to do. When states around the country adopt laws that make it harder for minority communities to vote, there is still more work to do. When unarmed African Americans, men and boys, are killed, names like Trayvon Martin, Jordan Davis, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, bring tears to our eyes, there is still more work to do. When protesters take to the streets to shout out, "Hands up, don't shoot," "I can't breathe," "Black Lives Matter," there is still more work to do. When a significant part of the American family is disenfranchised and doesn't trust politics or criminal justice, there is still more work to do. Congress must accept its responsibility. We need to start with bipartisan efforts to protect civil and human rights. We should pass the Smarter Sentencing Act, which I introduced with Senator Mike Lee, co-sponsored by Senator Leahy, the chairman of our full committee, Senator Ted Cruz, my ranking member on this subcommittee, and Rand Paul of Kentucky. That's quite a broad spectrum of political belief, and we all support this bill. We should restore federal voting rights for ex-offenders, a cause which has been championed by Senators Ben Cardin and Rand Paul. There are some 5.8 million Americans who, after paying their debt to society, still are denied a right to vote. And this type of disenfranchisement has a disproportionate impact on people of color. We need to pass the Voting Rights Amendments Act, which was authored by Chairman Leahy and Republican Congressman Jim Sensenbrenner. This bipartisan legislation is a response to the Supreme Court's 2013 Shelby County decision. This will be my last hearing as chairman of the subcommittee before I turn over the gavel to Senator Cruz, the incoming chairman. Clearly, there's much work to do, and I look forward to working with Senator Cruz and the 114th Congress as we continue to struggle to create a more perfect union. Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the member witnesses who are here today. There's no more important role for the United States Senate than to carefully guard and protect the civil rights of every American. We take an oath to uphold the Constitution, and that is a promise every American rightly should hold us accountable to honor. The Chairman and I agree on a number of matters concerning civil rights. We have, as he mentioned, both co-sponsored the Smarter Sentencing Act, which would reduce mandatory minimums for nonviolent drug offenders and help restore the proper balance of federalism, deterrence, and proportionality to these laws. We are also both co-sponsors of the USA Freedom Act, which I believe strikes a better balance between the need to combat terrorism through effective intelligence and at the same time protecting the privacy rights of everyday Americans. I would note additionally that the hearing this committee held on solitary confinement policy earlier this year was, I think, a positive and productive hearing that shed light on a practice of law enforcement at the federal level and state level that needs to change. All of those are positive. Yet at the same time, Civil rights remains a challenging topic in this country, a topic that is perceived differently by people of different racial backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds. We see the unfortunate reality that in the last 6 years, income inequality has increased. That in the last 6 years, the rich have gotten richer. The top 1% today earn a higher share of our income than any year since 1928. And yet people who are struggling, young people, Hispanics, African Americans, single moms, are finding their lives harder and harder and harder. When it comes to civil rights, I think there is no civil right more important than the right of every child to access a quality education. And in my view, the most compelling civil rights issue of the 21st century is the need to expand school choice and educational options so that every child, regardless of race, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of zip code, regardless of wealth, has a fair opportunity to receive an excellent education. Unfortunately, that has not been a focus of this committee. For the past 2 years, I am hopeful it will become a focus of the committee in the coming years. I would note as well that a disturbing pattern has been demonstrated over the last several years of the federal government violating the constitutional rights of the citizenry. Whether it is the IRS disregarding the First Amendment rights of citizens, asking individual citizens, tell us what books you're reading, tell us the content of your prayers. Whether it is a consistent disregard for the Second Amendment. Whether it is a disregard for religious freedom, including, unfortunately, the federal government right now litigating against the Little Sisters of the Poor, a Catholic convent of nuns who've taken vows of poverty, who devote their lives to caring for the poor and elderly, and yet they are in court with the federal government trying to impose millions of dollars of fines on them in order to force the nuns to pay for abortion-inducing drugs contrary to the religious faith. Beyond that, we have seen a pattern of lawlessness from the federal government that should trouble anyone concerned about civil liberties, concerned about the Bill of Rights. In my capacity as the ranking member on this committee, we have issued a series of 5 reports cataloging the disregard of the federal Constitution, the disregard of the Bill of Rights from the administration. Indeed, we cataloged 22 cases where the federal government has gone before the U.S. Supreme Court defending expanded federal power and has been rejected unanimously, 9-0. In one of those cases, the Department of Justice went before the U.S. Supreme Court and said the Bill of Rights says nothing about whether the federal government can put a GPS locator on any citizen's car. And the position of the Department of Justice was that that does not require probable cause, it does not require articulable suspicion. Indeed, under DOJ's position, every witness who attended this hearing today, every individual citizen who came, the federal government could go and place a GPS on your automobile outside without raising any Fourth Amendment concerns whatsoever. That was an extraordinary position. Thankfully, the U.S. Supreme Court rejected the Department of Justice's views 9-0. We need to be vigilant defending the civil rights of every American, and I look forward to this committee, the larger Judiciary Committee, and to the Senate continuing to do so. And we need to have a particular responsibility to safeguard the Bill of Rights. I would note the saddest moment during my time in the Senate was when 54 Senate Democrats cast a vote for a constitutional amendment to repeal the free speech protections of the First Amendment. That was not consistent with our obligations to protect civil liberties. And I am hopeful going forward we will be vigilant protecting the civil liberties of every American. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. We're going to turn to our first witness panel. I want to welcome our colleague, Senator Cory Booker, Congressman Luis Gutierrez, and Congressman Keith Ellison. And we're going to give Senator Senator Klobuchar an opportunity to introduce Congressman Ellison. I want to note that Congresswoman Judy Chu, chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, had a scheduled conflict and could not join us. Each of our witnesses are going to have 5 minutes to make a statement and answer questions that may come up afterwards. I will acknowledge 2 members and then turn to Senator Klobuchar to acknowledge the presence of Congressman Ellison. First to testify today will be Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey. Last month he was reelected to serve in the Senate 1 year after winning a special election. Senator Booker serves on the committees of Commerce, Science and Transportation, Small Business and Environment. He is currently the only Senate member of the Congressional Black Caucus. Following him will be Congressman Luis Gutierrez from my state of Illinois. Last month reelected to serve his 12th term, representing the 4th District. He's a member of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, serves on the House Judiciary Committee and the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. He previously testified before this subcommittee at our hearing on racial profiling in 2012 and our hearing on Stand Your Ground laws in 2013. Congressman Gutierrez will follow Senator Booker. Senator Klobuchar?
Thank you very much. We'll have to have our movie go up. We always have movies in the Senate, Congressman Ellison. It is great to be here with Senator Booker and Congressman Gutierrez. Thank you so much for being here. But I am really here to recognize my friend Keith Ellison. Keith and I go way back to when I was a prosecutor, the chief prosecutor in Hennepin County, and he was a criminal defense lawyer. But somehow we have remained friends through it all. And I think it is a testament to everything that he has stood for. Before he came to Congress again, he also did a lot of civil rights work, and so it prepared him for the work that he has done in the Congress. He was the first Muslim in Congress, and we are very proud of that in Minnesota, and he is a strong voice for justice and civil rights. We've worked on several bills together, environmental bills and other things, but I think the thing that's most appropriate for this discussion today is the Same-Day Registration Act, a bill that I'm carrying, working with Senator Tester on in the Senate, and he has it in the House, and it would reduce barriers to voting. And when we think about the grand jury issues and who serves on grand juries, this is actually relevant, Chairman Durbin. It's relevant because the list for the grand jury comes from voter rolls. They also come from other places, especially in Hennepin County, where we work to make sure other lists were included for who serves on grand juries. So when you limit who can vote, you actually also limit who can serve on grand juries, because that's where you get your source for people that serve on grand juries if you want to have grand juries that reflect our community as well as law enforcement that reflect our community. We've done a lot of great work in Hennepin County with DNA and with other things, videotaping interrogations that we're proud of. But I think that this is important to think about with the voter issues. There is a connection. Thank you very much, and we're glad to have you here, Congressman Ellison.
Mr. Chairman? Just 1 second, please. Twin cities, twin introductions. Senator Franken would like to say a word.
Well, first I just want to associate myself with Senator Klobuchar's remarks, mainly about Keith, less about the grand jury, but that's important too. But Keith is he's someone who has been talking about this, these encounters between members of minority community and law enforcement long before we've gotten to the recent challenges that we're talking about today and that people have been talking about. But very proud of Congressman Ellison.
Senator Cornyn?
Mr. Chairman, I just want to know if it would be in order to make a brief statement.
Without objection, please.
I appreciate that. I just want to add a couple of words by way of thanks to you for convening this hearing to talk about a very important issue that is to all Americans, and that is the state of civil and human rights in this country of ours. And I know your focus is primarily going to be on the criminal justice system, and I would say that I hope that this hearing will take a long view and not just a short-term view. Obviously on our minds the recent tragedies of what have occurred are fresh, but I think caution would tell us that we ought to wait until there's been a thorough investigation and all of the facts revealed before we draw any conclusions. But I also worry that that just the recent tragedies will somehow distract us in some ways from the great successes that law enforcement has had since the crime waves of the 1980s and 1990s. Since 93, violent crime rates are down 48% in this country. Law enforcement officer death rates are down 37%. Homicide rates are down 50%. Robbery rates are down 56%, and property crime rates are down 40%. So while we know that there are incidents that deserve and must be investigated and follow the facts wherever they must lead, I hope we keep that success in mind as well as part of the overall context. I would just finally say that, we've tried to get Senator Reid to take up some bipartisan legislation, part of which you mentioned earlier, the Sentencing Act that you and Senator Cruz and others are working on. But also, I want to mention the Recidivism Reduction in Public Safety Act that Senator Whitehouse and I co-sponsored here in the committee that got if I'm not mistaken, unanimous support in the committee, but we've just been unable. Well, we got 2 people didn't agree with us yet. We hope to convince them. But we weren't able to get time on the floor to be able to take that up. My hope is, after the new year, that we'll be able to get both of these bills up on the floor and thoroughly debate these issues, because I think we've seen that this is not an area of where partisanship has any role to play, that working together we can come up with some better solutions in our criminal justice system, even as we insist that tragedies like the ones that are fresh in our mind are thoroughly investigated and that we leave no stone unturned. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Cornyn. Let's get together, all of us interested in those 2 bills, and make sure it's a priority in our new Congress. Now let me recognize our colleague, Senator Cory Booker. Microphone.
I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member for having this, and I want to thank all my colleagues who are before me, each and every one of you. I've had discussions with, very encouraging discussions with, around these issues. You said very specifically, and I want to honor that the time for lamentations is past, the time for legislation is upon us. And I want to apologize if it seems that I'm going off of that directive, but I will end up right there. This is a very, very personal issue for me, this evolution of the United States towards its ideals. Children from Newark, New Jersey to Oakland, California stand up every day and say the Pledge of Allegiance that we are a nation with liberty and justice for all. But these last few weeks, we've seen tens of thousands of Americans taking to the streets in anguish and rage and frustration. And I agree with Senator Cornyn that it is too early in many ways to draw conclusions when there's federal investigation still going on many of those issues. And I appreciate the sensibility of his remarks. But please understand that the anguish that folks are feeling on the streets, the anguish that has penetrated this body and has had me pulled aside by Senate pages and many people who we walk by in this body who do the dignified, important work, yet menial work, who've asked me, please do something about this. What is that this they are talking about? I, as many of you know, was raised in a community in which my family in 1969, as the year of my birth, was the first black family to integrate this area. My classmates and teammates were all white growing up. My dearest and closest friends now, I feel blessed and privileged that I have people who are like blood to me of all different backgrounds. But I know growing up, our experiences as our parents talked to us about police officers, talked to us about behavior, there was dramatic differences between the exhortations of black parents, Latino parents, and white parents. I remember distinctly my parents lecturing me with anger in their voice that I did not have the margin of error when it comes to experimenting with drugs or other behaviors that others have. And what I want to do right now is put this in context of what you called us to talk about, which is legislation, and put it to a context to a horrible history in our country, that history of bias that we are desperately trying to work our way out of. In my lifetime, we have seen something happen that is remarkable on the planet Earth, which is the explosion of the American prison system, to the point now where America has 5% of the globe's population, but 25% of the world's, of humanity's imprisoned people. And by God, we do not have a country that has more criminals, more criminality, more crime-intent people than China or Russia or India. And that explosion of criminality has made us see in the last 30 years an 800% increase in the federal prison population. Half of those prisoners at the federal level and the overwhelming majority on the national level are non-violent offenders. Non-violent. Not picking up guns, not beating people in the streets, not assault. We as Americans, unlike any other country, bear the burden of spending $250 billion carrying this system. And the point that is felt in the anguish of staff I talk to here in the Senate and people protesting is not the specifics necessarily of cases, but of the knowledge that we all have, that none of my colleagues, Republican or Democrats, have denied to me, that this system is woefully biased against minorities in our country. The data screams that we all have access to and that we all know. That there's no difference, for example, in marijuana usage between blacks and whites in this country. None whatsoever. The last 3 presidents admitted to using marijuana, and I say for the record, one said he did not inhale. But yet, an African American is about 3.7 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana usage than someone that is white. That's a fact. We know we have a criminal justice system that has unconscionable outcomes that do not reflect the highest values that children of every ilk pledge allegiance to, values that we swear oaths to, that we should have what that building across the way says, powerfully written in stone, equal justice under law. And what do I mean by some of these things that jump up and call to the conscience of this country? We have a nation where African Americans make up 13% of the U.S. population, but 40% of the imprisoned population. In my state, it's 13% and 60+% of the prison population. Nonviolent offenses. That according to the 2012 report for the U.S. Sentencing Commission, between 2007 and 2009, drug sentences for African Americans, men, were 13.1% longer. That we know that Latino youth today, by the age of 23, 44% of Latino youth will be arrested. 44%. Many of them, most of them for nonviolent offenses. We know the sad reality for African American men. 1 in 3 African American males born today can expect to be incarcerated at some point unless we make a change. And when you hear about police violence, trust me, I was a mayor of a great American city. It was challenging and complicated in the constant battle against crime to keep my community safe. These are nuanced issues. We struggled with them in Newark. But we know that right now, there are 6.5 million people, whites, arrested against about 2.6 million African Americans arrested in a year. But ProPublica, and that means blacks and whites, violent crime, nonviolent crime, 6.5 versus 2.6, white to black. But now someone who's African American, according to data quoted by my Republican colleague Rand Paul in Time magazine, are 21 more times more likely to be shot dead by a police officer. African Americans 21 more times more likely to be shot dead by a police officer than someone white. And so I anguish over this fact that my country has been evolving through the dedicated, determined acts of black and white, through slavery, through Jim Crow, but I find myself a senator at a time that we have this ironic reality that there are more African Americans now in prison, under criminal supervision, prison, jail, probation, parole, than all the slaves in 1850. And so this is what sears into me as a painful reality, because we as a body, Congress has the power to change this. And the people, the elected leadership that's showing this most clearly is not coming from the federal level, it's actually coming from the states. And remarkably, refreshingly, it's coming from red states. Red state governors with their legislators are passing legislation that this body should be passing, that is showing clearly that you can deal with this over-incarceration problem through common sense, bipartisan legislation. The one example I'll give as I lead to my close is Georgia. Governor Nathan Deal, he's cut spending on prisons, reduced penalties for nonviolent offenses, and the results of his common sense reforms has been a dramatic reduction in the prison population, and guess what? A 20% reduction over 5 years in the number of incarcerated African American men in their state. A 20% reduction. And so we can say what we want about the details of Staten Island or Ferguson, but there's a larger issue going on that is anguishing their heart from young people working in this institution to cities and neighborhoods and towns all over our country. And the question is, enough of the lamentation, when will there be legislation? And so I conclude with that call. It's a call that has rang through the ages of our nation, that we have something so precious. This week, Jews all across our country will be reading a portion of the Torah that has a section with these words that are written and inscribed from the Torah on the very site that Martin Luther King was killed. I had the privilege recently of watching the movie Selma and seeing blacks and whites joining hand in hand, Latinos and other Americans, in this ideal of America that these issues are not black or white. They are about justice. They are about America. That people of good conscience, when there's clear and patent treatment being given to one body of Americans, not to another, that there's a call to act. It is this idea and this dream, and written on that place in Memphis, Tennessee, of the site that one of our great Americans, not great black Americans, one of our great Americans died, is the words from the Torah that call upon us now. Simply these: here cometh the dreamer, let us slay him and see what becomes of his dreams. There has been enough death in this country. There has been enough over-incarceration. It is time now that we make the dream real, and we, through our legislative efforts, as illustrated by state after state, can now follow suit, reduce our prison populations, lower crime, save taxpayers money, and more effectively herald the highest ideals of our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Booker. Congressman Luis Gutierrez of Chicago.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Cruz, for inviting me to testify at this hearing regarding the current state of civil and human rights in the United States. And thank you, Senator Durbin, for advocating for justice and equality. I've always valued your advice and counsel. Your leadership on the Judiciary Committee and as chairman of this subcommittee has contributed greatly to our nation and to protecting the civil rights of all of us, and I came here to say thank you. Before I begin, I want to extend my heartfelt condolences to the families and friends of Michael Brown and Eric Garner. I think we can all agree that the loss of life is a grave tragedy. As a parent, I especially want to say to the parents that I'm so sorry for your loss. In the wake of the grand jury decisions to not indict the officers involved in the deaths of Michael Brown and Eric Garner, communities throughout the country have taken to the streets to protest. Many are deeply dissatisfied with decisions not to prosecute the police officers in Ferguson and Staten Island, and transparently examine their actions and the circumstances that led to the deaths of 2 unarmed black men. The protests also expose an equally disturbing issue, that the killings of Brown and Garner are not an isolated issue. I believe the visceral reaction around the country is because these cases represent the countless young men who are treated unjustly by the police, and many question their ability to receive justice through the current court system. These deaths expose gaps in our criminal justice system, in particular the grand jury process, and the inherent conflict in bringing charges against law enforcement. Clearly, we have more work to do to build trust between communities and law enforcement and our system of justice. African Americans and Latinos are disproportionately impacted by the criminal justice system overall. Racial profiling, condoned officially or unofficially by some in law enforcement, forces blacks and Latinos to contend with the criminal justice system more frequently in a completely different way than many others in our society. Minority communities have a higher prosecution rate, and at the post-conviction stage, sentencing orders tend to be harsher among minority defendants. All too often, Latino and blacks are victims of excessive use of force at the hands of rogue police officers. The issue is only exacerbated when local and state police departments are equipped with military equipment, as was the case in Ferguson, Missouri this past summer. The cycle continues, as we saw just last week when grand juries, guided by prosecutors who work on a daily basis with the police, failed to even call for a trial in open court. It is not surprising that the system breeds mistrust. This vicious cycle not only affects individuals, but also affects our African American and Latino communities as a whole. When we see children like Michael Brown and Eric Gardner and Trayvon Martin, we see our own families and our own loved ones. Ask any Latino or African American parent whether they live in a suburb or in a housing project, and they will tell you they fear for their children's safety every time they leave the house. Rather than thinking of the police as public servants who will protect the safety of their children, too often they think of local police as one of the harshest their children have to face. I think only of my daughter, Jessica, who was stopped because she was driving in a too nice of a car. She was with her friends in her own neighborhood. Her mom and dad apparently made the mistake of living in a neighborhood they could afford to live in, not one the police officer thought she should be living in. Or when I was stopped and refused admission to this very Capitol complex earlier in my year because, as the Capitol Hill police officer said, I didn't look like a congressman. Too many have faced profiling, subtle and explicit, annoying and yes, potentially dangerous, when the profiler has a badge or has a gun. I respect and appreciate the hard work that law enforcement officers do to keep our community safe. We have worked to get more cops on the street, to invest in violence reduction programs, to reduce the number of guns in our communities that often target police officers, and to make sure we honor and pay police officers for the dangerous and often thankless work police officers do. I'm also proud to be an original co-sponsor of the End Racial Profiling Act, which I think is clearly and sorely needed. With regard to the revised profiling guidelines issued yesterday by the Department of Justice, I am deeply disappointed that they did not close significant loopholes, especially as they pertain to the Department of Homeland Security, which will allow whole sections of America's largest law enforcement entities, including Customs, Border Patrol, and Transportation Security Administration, to continue to profile many innocent Americans. I'm also perplexed and disheartened that the new guidance applies only to federal agents, but exempts local, county, and state law enforcement. Civil and human rights today in America continues to be a work in progress. Thanks to the leadership of Chairman Durbin and many of my colleagues, including those seated with me today, we are able to celebrate the strides we have made to create a more equal and just nation for all, and chart the course of continued progress in the future. But it is tempered by knowing that we cannot rest in the pursuit of justice and fairness, especially in the face of tragic and needless loss of life. We have come a long way. Senator Booker is a testament to that. My buddy Keith is a testament to that. I hope to be a testament to that. Let's continue to do the good work. I thank you for your wonderful leadership, Senator Durbin.
Thanks, Congressman Gutierrez. Congressman Ellison of Minnesota.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and also thank you to the ranking member. Also, special thanks to my fellow Minnesotans, Senator Klobuchar and Senator Franken, and the entire panel. And, of course, I was very moved by the words of my fellow panelists. They were amazing, and I want to say that ditto everything they said. Last week, 15-year-old Abi Samad Sheikh Hussein was run over by a man in an SUV, and that bumper sticker on his car said, "Islam is worse than Ebola." But today, I'm not here to talk and focus on private hate crimes and discrimination, although that deserves all the attention that we can muster. Today, I'd like to talk about the discrimination that happens at the hands of state actors. I think we should shine a light on all forms of discrimination, but I think that the events that we've seen over the last few weeks demonstrate how very important it is for the state and people who act on behalf of the state to get it right. People have a legitimate higher expectation of people who operate on behalf of the state. Our government is a democratic government and is undergirded by a constitution, and the people have every right to believe that the government is there to protect the general welfare. And that makes it all the more disappointing when people who operate on behalf of the state fail to live up to that expectation. People have a right to believe that they will be dealt with justly and fairly by the state, but when the state violates people's rights, it's fair for people to wonder, who's going to protect my rights if the state will not? And that's why people are particularly incensed by encounters between citizens and law enforcement. People are grateful for law enforcement. We believe in law enforcement. I am grateful for law enforcement, and I know people who are in law enforcement, most of them go into it because they want to help people. But when they fail and when excessive force is employed, it is incredibly disappointing, and it shakes people's confidence in what the state's supposed to do for them, which is to protect them and to promote their welfare. You know, the injustice we've seen over the past week is not new. It's not the first time the police have been videotaped using excessive force. None of us can ever forget Rodney King. It's not the first time people die in police custody, and it isn't the first time that a grand jury has vetoed justice. Why are people walking around with their hands up saying, "I can't breathe"? Why are people saying, "Don't shoot"? Why are they proclaiming these things all over cities in America? It is because of a long train of abuses, not one particular case. People who want to argue over the nuance of one recent case in the news or another are free to do so, but no one can deny the unmistakable pattern between police and community, particularly black community, and men in that community. We can talk about Eric Gardner and Michael Brown, but what about Tamara Rice, 12 years old? What about Darren Hunt, who had a toy? What about Rodney King? And by the way, not only is this a long train of abuses, it goes back further even than the Kerner Commission report, which said our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. 50 years ago, we were dealing with this same issue, and it is on us today, and we must make a call to action to reverse this trend so that every American, all Americans, can feel that the government really is liberty and justice for all. So instead of a system of justice that works for some, it doesn't work for all. This injustice takes place within a social and economic context. And I have to say that when Officer Wilson confronted Michael Brown on Canfield Drive in Ferguson, the interaction did not take place in a vacuum. Ferguson, Missouri's unemployment rate is 13%, over double the national average. The number of poor people in Ferguson doubled over the last 10 years. In 2012, almost all of Ferguson's neighborhoods had a poverty rate of over 20%. The fact is, if we respond by ordering body cams, ordering police cameras, this will be good steps. If we have grand jury reform, if we require that there are preliminary hearings in these officer-involved shootings so we can have more transparency, these will all be good things. But they will not stop the pattern unless we deal with the structural economic abandonment of cities like Ferguson. We cannot continue to solve our economic and social problems with criminal justice solutions. The fact that our low-income and minority communities are over-policed and underprotected is the spark, but poverty and economic deprivation is the kindling, and that's what lights the flame. I say yes again to body cams and all types of reforms, but please let us not forget that investing in infrastructure, education, public job programs, and providing for social supports which help people stay away from the hardest aspects of an unfair economy are essential. You do not sell Lucy's on the streets of Staten Island if you are making a livable wage. We know that we have an inequality problem when the CEO of Walmart makes over $12,000 an hour and the average Walmart worker makes $8.48. And the CEO of McDonald's makes $9,200 an hour and a cashier makes $8.25. So please do not forget that dealing with the economic deprivation that kindles these situations is incredibly important. It's important in the cases, the recent cases. It will be important in the future. I'd now like to turn my attention just for a moment to talk about the problems that affect the Muslim community in particular. Societal discrimination is real. I have been the direct victim of it myself. In my own state, only a few days ago, a county party chairman called Muslims parasites and said they should be fragged. That means to kill them violently. A state senator in Oklahoma said that American Muslims are a cancer in our nation that needs cutting out. So when we arrive at how the state deals with this Muslim population, we know that we're already dealing with a situation in which so many in the law enforcement community see the Muslim community as a security problem, not fully fleshed members of our community here to make a contribution. And so I, too, was disappointed in the guidance that was recently issued by the Department of Justice and believe that at no time can we have a system of justice in which someone's race or religion or what they're wearing can justify engagement by law enforcement. Law enforcement should engage citizens when there is some articulable suspicion that that person might commit a specific crime. And that should be the basis of the engagement until we say that racial profiling, religious profiling is actually bad law enforcement. We will continue to bother people and engage people who had nothing to do with any wrongdoing, and we will miss people who are up to no good and will harm us. Again, thank you, all the committee members and my panelists, fellow panelists, for this excellent presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Congressman Ellison, thank you. Congressman Gutierrez, it's great to see you over here again.
Thank you.
Senator Booker, thanks. We appreciate it as your colleagues. I dismiss with gratitude our first panel and thank them for adding to this. I want to acknowledge in the audience today is Martin Castro, Chair of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Good to see you, Marty. And now I'd like to call the second witness panel to come to the table. As they're coming to the table, I'll give you an introduction on them. One longtime friend, Wade Henderson, President, Chief Executive Officer of the Leadership Council on Civil and Human Rights. The Leadership Conference is the nation's preeminent civil and human rights coalition with more than 200 national organizations in its membership. Mr. Henderson, professor at the University of District Columbia David Clark School of Law. Prior to joining the Leadership Committee Conference, he was the Washington Bureau Director of the NAACP, graduate of Howard University and Rutgers University School of Law. Thank you for being here today. Dr. Cedric Alexander currently serves as president of NOBLE, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, on whose behalf he's appearing. He's the Deputy Chief Operating Officer in charge of the Office of Public Safety for DeKalb County, Georgia. Dr. Alexander previously served as Transportation Security Administration Federal Security Director for Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, Deputy Commissioner of the Office of Public Safety at the New York State Division of Criminal Justice, and Chief of Police in Rochester, New York, law enforcement officer for 15 years in Florida, a doctoral degree in clinical psychology from Wright State University. Dr. Alexander, thank you. Our next witness is a familiar friend, Laura Murphy, Director of the Washington Legislative Office of the American Civil Liberties Union, a position she's held on several occasions. She's the first woman, first African American, longest serving head of the Federal Affairs Operation in ACLU's 94-year history. She received her bachelor's from Wellesley College. It's the custom of this committee to swear in our witnesses. If you would all please rise. Do you affirm that the testimony you're about to give before the subcommittee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Let the record reflect that all three witnesses answered in the affirmative. And let me first call as the first witness Wade Henderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Cruz, and members of the subcommittee. I'm Wade Henderson, President and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, a coalition of more than 200 national organizations representing persons of color, women, children, organized labor, persons with disabilities, seniors, the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community, and the faith-based community. Let me start by thanking you, Chairman Durbin, for your remarkable leadership of this subcommittee. From the passage of bipartisan legislation like the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act and the Fair Sentencing Act, to chairing hearings examining voting rights, stand your ground laws, and the civil rights of American Muslims, you have been a champion on issues of vital importance to the civil and human rights community for years. Let me also acknowledge you, Ranking Member Cruz, in your role as the new chair of the subcommittee in the 114th Congress. Senator, we are hopeful that as the new chair, you will build on the subcommittee's legacy and continue to work in a bipartisan fashion to make progress for our nation. We look forward to collaborating with you to achieve our common goal of protecting and advancing civil and human rights for all Americans. This hearing is taking place at a pivotal time for the nation. The recent killings of unarmed black boys and men by police officers across the country have fueled a growing, diverse, passionate, and increasingly organized movement for justice across racial lines that cannot be ignored. In particular, the recent non-indictments of the police officers who killed Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and Eric Garner in Staten Island, New York, and the new information about the suitability of Officer Timothy Loman, who killed 12-year-old Tamir Rice in Cleveland, Ohio, remind us that though we live in a country founded on principles of equality and opportunity, African Americans and other communities of color still find that the promise of equality and opportunity has yet to be fully realized. On nearly every indicator that we use in the United States to measure progress, people of color are falling further behind, and in some important ways, doing worse than they were in 1960. Our schools have resegregated, our levels of unemployment are at an all-time high, we face continued discrimination in voting, and our incarceration rates have increased exponentially. So as we mark a number of anniversaries this year and next, including the Civil Rights Act, Freedom Summer, the Voting Rights Act, and Bloody Sunday, we must acknowledge and celebrate how far we've come. But we must also be aware of just how far we have to go in the quest for equality. Systemic obstacles to full inclusion and opportunity remain for our communities, and we failed to establish the justice and equality that we all seek. Now, without question, our criminal justice system is in crisis. Racial and ethnic bias and discrimination persist at every stage, from policing to trial to sentencing and finally to reentry. We should use our resources to more adequately address public safety and invest in alternatives to incarceration where appropriate. We must put in place common sense reforms that prohibit discriminatory profiling, demilitarize local law enforcement, redefine the standards for use of force by police, and establish accountability. We must eliminate harsh sentencing policies that disproportionately impact communities of color, and pass the bipartisan Smarter Sentencing Act, as well as assist with successful reentry. Finally, we need vigorous enforcement of hate crime protections and expanded, coordinated police community efforts to track and respond to hate violence and improve hate crime data collection. More than a decade after President Bush announced that racial profiling is, and I quote, wrong and we will end it in America, unquote, communities across the country, particularly African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, Arab and Muslim Americans, and those perceived to be Arab and Muslim, including South Asians, Middle Easterners, and Sikhs, are still subjected to profiling in a variety of contexts, including street-level enforcement, immigration enforcement, and counterterrorism efforts. Profiling is an ineffective law enforcement practice, is detrimental to public safety, and is antithetical to the constitutional right to equal protection under law. Now, yesterday, the Department of Justice issued long-awaited revisions to its 2003 profiling guidance for federal law enforcement. This represents an important step forward by expanding protected categories and limiting some of the existing loopholes. Where it falls short in the areas of national security, border integrity, and the failure to apply state and local enforcement, we will work with this administration to end profiling by all law enforcement. Further, the shortfalls in the guidance reinforce the need for Congress to act, and we will redouble our efforts to ensure passage of the End Racial Profiling Act in the 114th Congress. I'd like to turn next to voting rights. While the days of poll taxes, literacy tests, and brutal physical intimidation are behind us, voting discrimination is still a problem for many Americans. Last month's midterm elections were the first to be held without the protection of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act because of the Supreme Court's 2013 Shelby County versus Holder decision. And we saw increased efforts to implement new restrictions on voting, including mandatory voter identification laws, limits on early voting, last-minute changes of polling places, changes to methods of elections, and racially biased gerrymandering that disproportionately impact communities of color. As a result, we witnessed the most unfair, confusing, and discriminatory election landscape in almost 50 years. It is a disgrace to our citizens, to our nation, and to our standing in the world as a beacon of democracy. The 114th Congress must fix the Shelby decision by enacting the Bipartisan Voting Rights Amendment Act to ensure that no voter faces discrimination. These are big challenges, Mr. Chairman. The Leadership Conference's goal to create an America as good as its ideals is not just rhetoric. This is the critical and necessary work in which all Americans of good conscience should be engaged, particularly our elected officials who are charged with addressing problems of national importance. We look forward to working with you and the subcommittee on these important issues. Thank you, sir.
Dr. Alexander.
Thank you, sir, and good afternoon. Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Cruz, and members of the subcommittee. I bring you greetings on behalf of the Executive Board and members of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, commonly referred to as NOBLE. My name is Dr. Cedric Alexander, National President of NOBLE and Deputy Chief Operating for Public Safety, DeKalb County, Georgia. It is an honor to be here today to participate as a witness in the Senate's hearing on the state of civil and human rights in the United States. I want to acknowledge and thank you, Chairman Durbin, for holding this hearing and inviting me to participate. I speak to you from a perspective of a person who has over 37 years of law enforcement experience and who has held a number of high-level positions in federal, county, and city, local levels. In addition, I hold a PhD in clinical psychology, and quite frankly, Senator, some days I don't know whether that's an asset or a liability. But I represent an organization, NOBLE, whose mission is to ensure equity in administration of justice and the provision of public service to all communities and to serve as the conscience of law enforcement by being committed to justice by action.
It is my position that this country has the unique opportunity today to address the lack of trust and understanding of law enforcement by communities of color. It is imperative to every citizen that we collectively deploy solutions to the areas of training, community policing, and technology to ensure that as America is secure both domestically and internationally. Secondly, through these solutions, we're able to further the hopes and dreams of many of our forefathers in realizing true civil rights and human rights as stated in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The recent events in Ferguson, Missouri, and in Staten Island, New York, when combined with real and/or perceived attacks on civil rights legislation, have created an environment where many people of color feel disenfranchised by their national and local government. More importantly, there is a pervasive belief, right or wrong, that the lives of minorities are less valuable than that of their counterparts. So with that, let's talk about solutions to building bridges of understanding and partnership between enforcement and communities they are to serve and protect. Training, sir, being at the forefront of all of this, cultural competency is a critical component to bridging the gap amongst law enforcement and communities of color. It is the foundation for people of different cultures and socioeconomic backgrounds to interact effectively. When developed and implemented as a framework, cultural competency enables systems, agencies, and groups of professionals to function effectively to understand the needs of culturally diverse groups. It is critical that law enforcement reevaluates its training methodologies to ensure that they reflect the 21st century needs and incorporate cultural competency training for police officers that is part of the recruiting and in-service training. Militarization of police has become a growing concern and interest throughout our country in recent years to the use of tactical equipment and gear to combat everyday crime. The 1033 program was created by the National Defense Authorization Act in 1997 as part of the U.S. government's Defense Logistics Agency disposition services to transfer excess military equipment to local law enforcement agencies. Every year, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of military equipment flows from the federal government to state and local police departments. As a result, departments have implemented the use of military equipment, as seen most recently in Ferguson, Missouri, which to many Americans was unfairly targeted towards other American citizens. There must be justification, accountability, and training to support the continued use of such tactical measures and equipment. Noble feels that training is a key component of ensuring the correct application of this type of resource. Community-oriented policing, which we all have heard a lot about over the years. It is our recommendation that the law enforcement community adopt community policing as a philosophy of policing in this country. Here are some of the key components of community policing. Community policing allows officers to demonstrate their support for the community. Residents and officers are allies. Officers respect and protect the civil rights of residents. Racial profiling and other forms of discrimination are strictly prohibited. Community policing demand that officers interact with people who live or work in neighborhoods that they patrol. Officers are trained to communicate with people, solve community problems, and develop an appreciation of cultural and ethnic differences. And the other side of that, sir, is very important as well, too, that communities work closely with police, align themselves with their local police, and become partners. This is not a one-way street. This is a two-way street when we talk about public safety. It takes everyone, police and community together, in order to provide the type of public safety I think that we all want to embrace in our respective communities. Community policing emphasized the importance and the value of human life. The use of excessive force is absolutely prohibited, and deadly force is reserved strictly for when an officer's life or the life of a citizen is at risk. Noble has launched a pilot program entitled The Law in Your Community. Through funding from the Department of Justice COPS Office, This program aim is to develop trust and understanding between law enforcement and the community. The Law in Your Community is an interactive training program for young people between the ages of 13 and 18 years of age. It is designed to improve their communication with law enforcement officers and their understanding of federal, state, and local laws. Components of the program include, but not limited to, citizenship. What does it mean to be a citizen? What are the laws governing everyday life, including traffic laws? And what are your rights as a citizen? Basic laws. Understanding the basic laws of issues such as gun ownership, staying safe within your community, maintaining positive affiliations with others, including peer relationships, maintaining good grades, adult relationships, and the benefits of having mentors. Law enforcement engagement, educating young people and adults on how to engage and navigate communication with local law enforcement officers. What is community policing, and have a better understanding of the realities of working in law enforcement and working with those who do that job. And lastly, technology. We feel that technology can be leveraged to support effective implementation of community policing and ensure maximum transparency to the public. Through technology, partnerships with communities can be strengthened in the area of problem solving and partnership initiatives. Likewise, there is an important role in applying technology and improving the effectiveness of law enforcement training. Listed are some of those technology recommendations. Requirements of body cameras for every law enforcement officer in this country. Every law enforcement officer in this country. Deployment of various social media platforms to allow law enforcement departments to better communicate and interact with local residents. And of course, use of force and firearm training systems, which will help them to develop and sharpen their skills of shoot and don't shoot. By implementing these recommendations on training, community policing, and technology, we believe that real progress can be made in improving the relationship between law enforcement and communities they serve. This would greatly improve the state of civil rights and human rights in America. I thank the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify and would be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Alexander.